Welcome to the Men's ADHD Support Group. This is Shane Thrapp, Operations Director for the nonprofit that we run of the same name. I am joined today by William Kerb of Hacking Your ADHD, one of the top ADHD podcasts out there in the world. William is a known speaker at the International ADHD Convention 2023, and he is joining us today to celebrate his 200th episode. William Kerb, welcome to the Men's ADHD Support Group.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for doing this. Because this is crazy that it's like 200 episodes. And then also even crazier that I figured out that I needed to do this before it's happening.
Right?
It's like, technically, I'm not actually at 200 yet. I'm at 198. I was like telling my wife, like, oh, we should, I'm going to be doing this recording for the 200th episode. She's like, we should celebrate. I'm like, well, that's still a couple weeks off. I have to do this for this part first.
So let's get into it. When did you create Hacking Your ADHD, and why did you create it? What motivated you for this?
So it was a culmination of a lot of things where podcasting was something I had been interested in. It was not Hacking Your ADHD wasn't my first podcast, but I was like, I had previously done one on Ultimate Frisbee that I burned out on because of ADHD, although at the time I did not know that. And it was me like, I want to do something like that again. And so I had started doing ADHD coaching and figuring out more about how my ADHD works. And I was like, I want to keep doing more of this stuff. I want to do more of this writing, and I want to get back into the podcast game. And I would like to do these. At the time, I had been really enjoying a lot of these short form content podcasts that were just like, hey, there's an idea. Listen to the idea. That's all the podcast is. And it was just like a host talking, usually not guest format. And I was like, these are great because I can actually listen to the whole podcast in one go, and I can kind of get an idea. And that was enough to make me be like, this is inspiring me to do something with that time that I've just listened to this. I was like, I want to do the same thing, but with ADHD stuff.
I like it. That's one of those things that I've done a bunch of podcasts. I've done one on ethical non-monogamy and ADHD, obviously. We're on one. But I've also done some on just whenever I was going through that atheist phase and just kind of doing different things like that. So it's just there's always some sort of joy when it comes to being able to share your thoughts out there into the world. And you've kind of turned that into a fairly popular podcast. What's been the most surprising thing about this journey along the way?
So I think the most surprising thing as someone with ADHD is that I'm still doing it. That there is a way to build in this consistency when I don't have a boss, when it's just something I am doing. I am doing this as my job now, and I'm working on doing some more monetization things so that I can continue doing it. But even so, with ADHD, there is this maybe I'm just not going to wake up and not do it anymore kind of thing, where so many things in my life where I'm like, oh yeah, I just stopped doing that. And then I'll go, why? And I have no idea. And so having done this for now almost 5 years, it's like, that's a ton of time to have sunk into this. And yeah, so I mean, and if I do the math of oh, I have 200 episodes and it's 5 years, well, that's not an episode every week, but that's also a great yeah, I don't have to put up something new every week. Even if I'm not, there have been weeks I've missed just because life. And
Right.
being able to oh, I can get back up on this horse. And that's been something I've thought about for okay, how can I apply this to other areas? What are ways that I can kind of build in this resilience? Because that's such a hard part about ADHD, where you're just I don't know how I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, definitely understand that, man. That consistency of, it may not be every week, but we are doing it as often as we possibly can. We've talked about this before in conversations that we've had and things along those lines. Whenever we're trying to really develop that system that works for us, it's learning about how the ADHD affects us and how to kind of process through the different things that we're processing. when you've kind of been working on all these different things, how often do you use the hacks that you're talking about in your own personal life that you're learning along the way? You talked about a couple of them. What's some of the ones that have really worked out for you in other ways?
It's one thing is just being like diving into the consistently inconsistent parts of things where I'm just like, hey, I don't have to do this the same way every time. And then, but yeah, also picking out the tools that work, working with a time timer is one of the things that I like, just sits on my desk and I click it on to make sure that I'm taking breaks. Cause that's one of the things that this is one of the topics I always harp on during episodes. It's like, hey, you need to stop sometimes and you need to take breaks. It's like, there'll be days I'm like, why I can't I think about what next sentence needs to go in this episode? And then I'm like, oh, because I've been working for an hour and a half, and that's way too long, and I need to go for a walk. So,
Hmm.
and going for walks, that's something I do all the time. That is a tip that I always give people, like, hey, get outside, get some movement in. Works great. Something I do all the time. And then trying to think of some of the other tips that I use frequently. I mean, accountability is one that I do. I will jump into a number of different accountability groups online and be like, hey, I'm going to be working on this for the next hour. And doing that like co-working stuff is, I think, one of the great ways to get things done. Although I'm like thinking, like, I've not done that in weeks, and I don't know why. Just haven't.
I Yeah, me and my buddy Christian Rat at focus101.com we're actually talking about that. And like he talks about because he runs that body doubling group. I've talked about it before, and he was talking, he was like, I just don't understand why people don't use this as often. I said, because they have ADHD and they don't think about it. So we have to like work out to like how do we give them reminders that don't get lost in the spam and things of
Mhm.
that nature. And I'm like, well, let's make sure we're giving them tips and tricks. And I remember I was listening to your podcast. It was one you did on the body doubling and stuff like that. And I said, hey, I got a question. Like you have notifications through emails, right? But do you have notifications through like the app or anything? He's like, no. I was like, maybe we should look into doing that. And he was like, I hadn't even thought about that. And I was like, well, there we go. And so it's funny because whenever we think about being podcasters, we don't really realize how influential the things that we're doing actually are. Like, how surprised are you, like when you go to like the conferences and people recognize you? Because I remember like seeing you at the 2023 conference, and you were just like, people know me.
It's weird because while I do interact with people through comments and stuff, I don't have not super active on like social media or anything. And I don't plan to change that really because especially this time of year, not a good time of year to be on social media. Apparently, like every 4 years or so, I have this really negative experience on social media. I don't know what that's about, but I'm going through that right now. So I'm like, I don't have any plans to come back. But one of the it's weird when one of the things I've consistently heard from guests on the podcast is they're like, hey, thank you so much for having me on. I had like an actual uptick in my business that I normally don't see going on to podcasts. And I'm like, oh man, people really trust me. I really need to be cognizant that people trust me. I can't just do whatever. I had some episodes where I'm like, I'm gonna pull this because this is not really what I want, because it was less science based than I thought. Because sometimes I'll be having a conversation, I'm like, oh, I'm just mentally pulling out what you're saying that's valuable and tossing away what's not. And then, like on reflection, I'm like, oh, not everyone's doing that because they don't have all the same background knowledge that I have.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, okay, if I'm doing that, I need to be much more cognizant of that people are listening to me and they're trusting me. And while that is what I want, it means being even more careful with what I say and who I have on.
What's been some of the things that when you heard it, and like not to call out anybody specific or anything like that, but what's some examples of things that you've been talking to somebody and you're like, oh, that's actually not safe, or that's not something I want to promote? Examples that you can give that don't completely call out whoever did it.
I mean, I can do one. I never published it. Like I recorded and I never published the episode because it got way too much into people talking about what having like a healthy ADHD diet would look like. And I was like, there's nothing in literature that says that this is correct. Like,
Yeah, we see that a lot with like the carnivore diet and paleo diet and things of that nature. I see a lot of that coming up in the men's ADHD support group. And like, look, there's actually probably there's a lot of science behind like, okay, these are not like horrible, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're safe either, you know.
yeah,
And so I definitely understand that one.
yeah, and there's just people being like, "This is going to cure your ADHD," kind of stuff, and I'm like, if you do something and it cures your ADHD, you didn't have ADHD. You had something else that was presenting ADHD like symptoms.
Hmm.
And so that could help someone, but that's not what is really the right thing to talk about here.
Yeah, curing ADHD I see that in the group and like, how do I cure my ADHD? And especially my ADHD parents group that I run. Like, how do I cure my child of their ADHD? And like, hey, your child doesn't have like a disease or anything like that. Like, how often do you hear that kind of concept? Like, how do
More
I
often
cure
than I
it?
like, but
Right?
not from guests I have on the show regularly, fortunately,
Hmm.
because that's not the kind of like I do have people that like apply it. I'm like, I remember one person I had send me emails and I'm like, "What? You're a disbarred doctor. There is no way I'm having you on my show." They cured ADHD with progesterone, I believe. Um, and I was like one of those things that I kept looking like I initially looked and I'm like, no, and I'm like, I kept looking into it more, being like, just what is going on here? This is insane.
Yeah, I definitely understand that one. The amount of things out there that kind of keep coming up in the world whenever I'm looking into it is giving children CBD and like THC with CBD in it. It's also like all of the different supplements and the different things like that. And like I'm like, y'all, yes, there's some benefits to a lot of this, but y'all are doing some harm as well as stuff like that. Like I definitely understand where you're coming from there.
Yeah, I was really surprised recently because I've been doing some episodes on ADHD research, what it is, how it's funded, how
Hmm.
everything around ADHD research and how it works, what a paper is and what's in a paper. And one of the things that I was like, I'm going to definitely need to spend some time on is there is a lot of ADHD research that is funded through pharmaceutical money.
Hmm.
And so that makes people really nervous and not exactly unfoundedly so.
Right.
There have been a ton of like negative things that pharmaceutical companies have done. If you go from like,
OxyContin,
yeah, Oxycontin,
hydrocodone,
yeah,
opioids. Yeah.
insulin, all these things where you're like, they are definitely putting profits over people 100%. And so I was like, okay, so this is a problem. Let me look into what is actually happening here. And I'm like, okay, so well, first, most ADHD research is actually government funded through the NIH.
Hmm.
Okay, that's great to know. They have a lot less of a bias. Like, could there be corruption involved? Sure, but that's not the immediate concern.
Right.
Then you're also like, okay, then a lot of the drug trials are mandated by the FDA because they have to prove that they are not harmful and that they're safe and they're effective. Like that's like the before you can market any of these pills. And so then I'm like, okay, well, if that's the case, let's see. We know these other negative things with pharmaceutical companies. Do we have any evidence of actual negative things with ADHD research? And it I didn't come up with a lot of stuff that was credible.
Right.
Was really I was like, oh, this for as much crap as they get, this is like the stuff is they're like they're too aggressive with marketing Adderall. And I'm like, okay, that's fair, but I don't marketing is marketing. Like all
Right.
marketing is pretty much too aggressive.
Especially in today's age.
I'm like, that's fair. I mean, even like we talked about the opioids a minute ago, that was also something where they were too aggressive with the marketing, but I'm like, not great, but it's not a deal killer for me anywhere here. And I was like, okay, well, and then they're like, well, there's also like the uh DSM-5 board included a lot of people that had ties to the pharmaceutical companies. And I was like, yes. And they're like, and they made the diagnostic criteria for ADHD too inclusive. I'm like, I don't agree with that. And then there are some people that were mad that they're like, Chad had got money from the pharmaceutical companies, and then they were trying to move amphetamines from Schedule 2 to Schedule 1. And I'm like, that's the ADHD community wants that.
Yeah. I
Like
mean,
it is hard to get our medication. We would like it to be easier.
it's not just that though, but you think about the industries out there that require drug testing for driving, so truck drivers and things like that. I mean, we see a lot of this in the men's group, and I know you've heard about this a lot. It's been like drivers who can't get medications because if they take them, then they're they're grounded. They can't
Yeah.
fly planes, they can't drive trucks, they can't do any of these federally regulated jobs because of the medication that they're like required to take to be able to manage their ADHD. That's a big deal.
Yeah. And so, and yeah, so I like looked at all these complaints and I was like, okay, one of them has some water and it's all, but it's not serious.
Mhm.
It's could be a better situation, but I don't think there's much you can do about aggressive marketing.
Right. Like, I think the only real negative studies that I've seen about ADHD medications almost always revolve around, like, I can think of one that was done in Australia that was based on addiction levels, and they were
Mhm.
testing Adderall on neurotypical people and how addictive it could be, and the negatives that come from abusing Adderall.
Mhm.
And I remember there was a big kerfuffle whenever that came out because they were like, "Oh, look, it can cause cardiovascular issues." And I'm like, "Yes," because they were testing it on people who were taking 3 or 4 times the highest recommended dose,
Mhm.
and some of it was in like snorting it.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, if you abuse a drug, there are hazards to that. It's like that doesn't matter who it is, but if they're abusing it, then that's a legitimate abuse of the drug. But like whenever we're looking at medication that's being used by what's being diagnosed and being used in responsible ways, and it's being held within the guidelines that we have, the opposite is most likely true because they put the guidelines at a lower level of what is most often effective for medication usage for a lot of people. And this is what y'all really need to be looking at is like, what are the most actually effective levels of medication that people actually need? Because the range that we have that's mandated by the FDA is often on the conservative low end. And there's
Yeah.
people out there who need twice as much because that's how it has to be used to be effective for them. And I'm like, so yeah, definitely some work that needs to be done as far as that. But it's really cool to know. And now I actually have to go back and I'm on a backlog of I think I'm like 13 episodes back on my backlog of listening to. So now I have to go through and listen to those because that sounds like really entertaining. No,
Yeah.
it's 14 episodes. Shoot. Anyways.
I'm, uh, I'm a little concerned. My last one ended up a little more dry than I wanted it to be because I was literally just like reading through like what a paper is, what you have to, if you want to read a paper, what you should look for. And also just kept reiterating this point. If you want to know about ADHD research, don't go read peer reviewed journals because you don't know how to read them.
As somebody who reads them for shits and giggles, I definitely get that one. I find them hilarious and fun to read. And then, of course, I go to talk to my wife about them. And I'm like, hey, baby, I could tell you that. Did you read the one I sent you a couple days ago about the ADHD medication? And she's like, no, no, I didn't read it. Do you understand how mind-numbingly, stupidly boring those are? And I'm like, no, they're great to read. Look at the numbers. Look at all the different statistics that I've like. Did you not see the chart that shows the correlation between? She's like, this is how I know you're autistic, and I'm like, what? She's like, this. You understand that nobody else finds these things interesting. I'm like, I have friends of mine. She goes, how many of them have ADHD and or autism? I don't know. Fair points. So
Like, look, it's numbers that prove things. That's great.
it makes me happy. Oh man.
But
So
yeah, I was just like, yeah, to make sure that people don't take the wrong point from that too. Is like, I'm just saying that like when people go and read journals very casually, that there's a lot of places that you can misinterpret results because if you
Mhm.
don't know the literature ahead of time.
What resources do you suggest people use that does break those kinds of things down into, like, manageable chunks or things like that?
Well, that's my next episode that I haven't written yet,
Oh,
which will come out before this, but again, have not spent the time. But yeah, I mean, Chad is a great resource for
mhm,
finding stuff. They have things. And then, I mean, the whole point of this too was to be like, hey, this is how most people aren't going to go out of their way to look for stuff. What's more likely happening is that they're going to have someone on TikTok pop up on their feed and they're going to see something and they're going to go, this study says this. And I want you to be able to just take a look at the study and go, that's a white paper from a pharmaceutical company. I don't know if I trust that. Or that's a book that no one has cited. And being able to like go, okay, there are red flags for what I should trust and shouldn't trust when people are citing sources. And because, even if you go to like read like Attitude magazine, there are going to be some things where you're like, is that really true? And then you're going to have to like, what does that mean in the broader spectrum of what I want
mhm.
to understand from ADHD research? Because is this new research that's just coming out, or is it something that's, part of a larger body of evidence?
Yeah, definitely understand that. I find myself going down the rabbit hole of the backlinks whenever I go to Attitude Magazine, because they actually do a great job of, like, citing the sources and everything, and so I'll find myself like, "Oh, what? Click. What does this mean? Oh, cool. That's a new article. Da, 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 da. Oh, there's another one. Click." And then all of a sudden, 14 hours later, it's like, "Oh, okay, I'm fully versed on all things neurochemistry." It's
Yeah.
like, man, I lost myself a couple of days ago on that one. So
Yeah. And but then yeah, you can also find things where you're like, I'm like, oh, there's this one stat I hear all the time of like ADHD children receive like what, like something like 10,000 more reprimands in the while growing up than
20,000. Yeah.
yeah. And I was like, oh, I want to look up where that stat came from. And I think it's William Dobson that said it, but it was just like something he said in a thing. There's no research behind it.
Yeah, and it's actually based off of a thing, I can't think of her name, but it was a lady who said it in 2005, and then William Dodson quoted her, and then it got attributed to him. And, like, it makes sense, like, but again,
Yeah.
this is my bias speaking, but and it does make sense, but, like, where's the study that backs that up?
Yeah.
And she was speaking to her personal experience with, helping children with ADHD and, like, the views that she had seen and the parents and their complaints and all of that stuff. And it was just a combination of all the different things she had heard by parents over the years of her studying it. And then, of course, it was also said by him, and I was like, "So this is people's anecdotal experience that they're using to justify this statement that they made. Could we do a study on that?" That's where my brain immediately goes like, "Hey, who do I have to talk to get them to actually do a study about that kind of thing?"
Yeah. I'd kind of like to see studies on that. And I mean, I'd love to see like a more open source ADHD research, like consortium kind of thing.
Man. So, so a few of my buddies and I crashed the research roundtable at the 2023 International Conference last year, and, like, we're not researchers. We don't wear white coats. None of us are lab rats, nothing. We rolled up in there like we, like, knew what the heck was about to happen, and we just sat down, and as we were sitting there, and we were just listening to them talking about it and everything like that, me and my buddy looked at each other, and Adam Pena and Braden Young, we were just sitting there, we were looking at each other. We actually know what they're talking about. And, of course, me. Like, I get to use my abilities for, I'll say good in this case. It was like, I just popped in. Let me be socially awkward here and, like, be a weird guy in the corner. Like, hey, just curious. Like, why don't y'all do studies about this kind of thing? And of course, in this room, there's a whole bunch of researchers and there's a whole bunch of different people who are like scientists and stuff like that. And then there's a couple of editors. And the editor pops up. He goes, it's really hard to get stuff like that out there because if you're not able to get a professor who's a written professor to actually co-write with you, it's really hard for you to get your research into the papers that are out there.
Hmm.
And then, of course, that started the conversation because a lady popped off and she goes, do you mean to tell me that the reason why my papers aren't getting put into journals is because I don't have somebody who's already an authored journal writer co-writing it with me. He's like, the reality of the situation, yeah. He's like, nepotism is the name of the game in the journal writing industry. And I'm like, and I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh. So when you're sitting here talking about papers and how they're getting put into the system,
Mhm.
like how much research is out there that people are doing that isn't being put into journals simply because there's not enough old white dudes who are willing to put their name on it.
Yeah, and
And I'm like,
submitting to journals is expensive. It's not
mm-hmm,
a free resource for them. Journals make a ton of money and do not pay the scientists for what they're putting out.
yeah, yeah. So that's what I think. That's why I think things like Attitude Magazine and Chad are so important. Is so many researchers are starting to understand that their research may not be able to get put into journals, but here's resources that they can submit and actually have medical reviewed. And while it's not a journal, it is a resource for people to use to kind of submit things like that. So really
Now,
looking forward to that.
just this is also not on topic for what we're supposed to be talking about, but very relevant here is a thing I saw that recently that was studying like they took a study of 400,000 researchers and saw where they were within 5 years of their last published article and or of their like first published article, and 80% or so were out of academia. Like they weren't doing any more research because the private sector pays so much better than
Hmm.
actually doing research. And I was like, oh, that's a problem.
Yep, 100%. So let's kind of switch subjects. I'm super curious about this one. What's some of the myth and misconceptions about ADHD that you keep having to come back to?
That's trying to think of what I have to come back to versus what I because I'm like there's all like the pop culture stereotypical ADHD stuff that's like I don't have to hit that much as much anymore.
Hmm.
But I think one of the ones that I personally keep coming back on is that this idea of that being is it's not ADHD, it's just that you're lazy. And I think that is personally something that I keep coming back to because of its internalized messaging that I've received throughout my life. And I think that's a more important part about myths is like not what do other people say, what do we say about ourselves that's not true? And I think that one is the huge one because we're like, with executive dysfunction, it can feel like we're being lazy. It can look like we're being lazy. It's like, I really want to do that thing, but I'm not. Or even, I don't even really want to do the dishes, but I know I should. But I can't get up and do them. I'm like, and that's like, that feels like the definition of laziness is of not doing the thing that I know I should be doing. But it's not. I want to do them. I want to get up. I'm like, I don't want to have a messy kitchen. I don't want this existence. And so fighting this like myth of laziness has been something that I come back to a lot because it's something that I know resonates with a lot of people because then when they hear that, they're like, it's this lifting of a burden that's been on them because it doesn't help to say that you're lazy. There's nothing you can do about being lazy except being just go and do the thing. So when you're like, man, I'm just lazy and I don't do it, and you're like, well, just do it. That 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 doesn't help. What And so when you go from this lens of executive dysfunction instead, you're like, okay, so it's not laziness. I just am having executive dysfunction about doing the dishes. What can I do then that will help get me over this hurdle rather than just saying I should do it? And then you have options like listening to music, putting on a podcast, making it fun, dishes for time, and doing all that kind of stuff where you're like, oh, I need to do something different. It's not laziness. It's about finding out what I actually need to do here.
Yeah, that reminds me that there was probably a meme or something like that that I read. It was like if you were if you were being lazy, then you would enjoy what you were doing instead.
Hmm.
And and of course, like I'm reading that and I'm like, you know what? No, I'm spending like 2 hours beating myself up and scrolling through social media like, yeah, I'm scrolling through social media, but I'm also like internally, I'm just like whipping myself to death for not getting up and doing the dishes. And like there's no it's just mindless scrolling. I'm just doing that instead of the thing that I know I should be doing.
Yeah, it's like I don't want to be doing this. And I'm like,
Like,
okay. And even if I'm like, okay, I'm gonna put my phone down, and then I'm like, I'm still stuck.
mhm.
Uh
There's a
and
spot on the wall that I stared at for 15 minutes now.
yeah, I'm like, oh, my dog is on my lap. I don't want to interrupt, make her get off. Not that she would care at all, because she'd go to another spot that she loves, and
Right?
it's yeah, it's but yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like, yeah, it's not, if I enjoyed what I was doing, that would be, and then even if I'm enjoying what I'm doing, that doesn't mean that not doing something else was me being lazy either. I
Hmm.
was like, because it's this weird like Protestant ethic that we've like built up where we always have to be productive, and that's not true. That's in fact a bad advice. It's a
It
bad idea
really
to
is.
try and never stop working. It's like, okay, I need to take breaks, and then if I'm mindful of when I take those breaks and I can enjoy them, that means I have less executive dysfunction and can do the things that I want. So if I am feeling executive dysfunction, maybe the answer is not figuring out the thing to go and do the dishes. Maybe it's figuring out how to be like, okay, I'm not going to do them right now. I'm going to take a real break right now
Hmm.
and enjoy my break and get recharged. So then in half an hour, I can do the dishes.
That's something I've actually had to help a couple of my clients understand. Is like, hey, it's okay to just take a break and rest. And like, in it, like my common mantra, and you've heard me talk about this before, is like you need at least 1 hour a day where you don't have to do anything. Like you don't have to pay attention to your kids. You can have your quiet space in your room. You can play video games. You can read a book. You can go for a walk. You can do anything that you want to do without being bothered by anyone. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Like 1 hour out of 24 hours is that you should be doing something nice for yourself. And then like one day a week where you get to go do whatever the heck you want and you get to go mess around and do all the things that you want to do. That's okay. This is something you really should be putting into your life. And like that's part of resting. That's part of recharging. It will make you more productive in the long run, especially when people are just dealing with that same kind of work ethic and mind ethic. I had a guy who was mad at himself because he was going to school for his master's degree. He was working two jobs and he still didn't feel like he was doing enough to make enough money to provide for his family. And I'm like, you know, do you like do you feel like this is sustainable? He's like, yeah, but how can I make more money though? I've got to make more money. Like what kind of passive income can I put in my life? I'm like, I don't know. Take a nap.
Yeah.
It's just like just take a nap. Like go, go relax. He's like, that doesn't make me any money. I'm like, technically speaking, yes, it does. I said, because it'll make you more productive. And if you're more productive more efficiently, then you'll make more money. Like
Yeah.
it just didn't resonate with him. It just didn't lock because he was so locked into that mindset you're talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, it is hard to get out of, because it's so much of this like built up society expectation that that if you are not doing, that it is uh, bad, that you are morally failing.
Hmm.
Like one of the tropes I hate the most when I see it in fantasy and science fiction and stuff is someone that's like stayed awake for like 4 days. It's the battle, and they're staying awake for 4 days because that's how they're going to like save the day, is by never taking a break. And I'm like, that person is fucking useless at this point.
Oh yeah, 100%. They're currently hallucinating.
Yeah. Like,
Those are not bugs they're shooting at. Those are their own troops.
yeah. And so I'm like, yeah, when the trope goes, yeah, they're never going to take a break again because that's not how. I'm like, I hate this.
So, what do you do to take breaks?
So I mentioned earlier, take walks. That's one of the easy things. I live very close to, I live in a nice walkable neighborhood that also has paths that go out into the forest. So I can like go and be in nature, which is great. Listen to podcasts while I do that. I also will do Lego sets. I love doing those while I'm, yeah, taking a break, being like, okay, I'm going to take some time off, do some Legos. Got some behind me. It's a fun one. There's so many Legos in my house. Both my kids love Legos now, and then have my own, and they're like, I'm going to take your sets too. And I'm like, no, these ones are the not play ones. You have
Mm-mm.
thousands of others. And of course, video games are a great break when used appropriately. Can be sometimes get to that thing like, this is the only thing I want to do. Okay, that's a problem now. I need to figure out how I can do other things, because if I'm only doing video games, then I also don't enjoy it. And some other, you know, just doing TV shows, that stuff. And I also really like Ultimate Frisbee.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you still doing that? Because last year you hurt your leg pretty bad, and then you had to take a break.
Yeah, it's there's a group in my area, but they don't meet all the time. And so it's hard to like both plan, like they're like, we'll meet some weekends on Saturday or Sunday. And I'm like, well, that makes it really hard to plan with kids whether I'm going to be available or not.
How many of the leaders have ADHD?
No. I mean, that's one of the funny things of like being in my age group and the number of people I've met that have been like, I've gotten along with, and then later they're like, oh yeah, it turns out I have ADHD too. And I'm like, I am not surprised.
I think that's one of those things, and we kind of touched on it earlier about the DSM-5 being too inclusive and everything. And I know this is going to shift the conversation and everything. Do you ever feel like your knowledge of ADHD is like hammer and like you keep seeing nails everywhere?
Sometimes, yes, I'll be like, oh, that looks like classic ADHD. But then I try to view it as one of the things. I'm like, ADHD is so internal. I don't know enough about why you're doing the things you're doing to always be like, that's the right diagnosis. But there's definitely, I've been like listening to a podcast or something and go, that person 100% has ADHD. The way they are describing their life and like their struggles, that is what ADHD is. And, but then I like, will step back. I'm like, oh, but what if I'm not seeing the whole picture? Because there are so many things that mimic ADHD, like sleep apnea, like something a lot of people with ADHD have, but also is having crap sleep. You will have the same symptoms as you have with ADHD.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many podcasts I've been on in the past 3 years where we're having the conversations and I'm talking about the things that I've gone through and the things that I've seen with the men's group and the things that I've seen in Dueling Minds and talk about ADHD and autism and dual diagnosis and how many people like either midway through the conversation, that's one of the more popular times where they kind of sit back and they're like, yeah, we were going to be talking about this, but I need you to really help me understand ADHD better because what you're describing and what my life has been like has been really similar. And I'm like, well, in the back of my head, I really do try my best to like not treat every nail I'm the hammer whenever I'm thinking about the ADHD. But what I do try to do is just kind of make sure that I am being very cognizant in presenting ADHD in the most like accurate way as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
And I have that joy because you and me, we both have a really good understanding of the DSM-5 and the diagnosis and stuff like that. And we're not doctors or anything like that, but we are well educated enough to be able to at least explain it in a way that other people will understand it, which I think has been one of the biggest keys to your success is your ability to explain it to people in ways that like really are easy to grasp.
Mm-hmm.
How did you learn to, or has this always just been something that you've been good at, like to break these concepts down into the ways other people would understand as easily as they do?
It is not something I had always thought of as a skill,
Mhm.
because it is me just trying to be like, break out my thought process, being like, here is, and I mean, when I do my writing, I will write a first page draft of something that is never going to see the light of day because it makes no sense. I do typically don't write very linearly when I'm doing my first draft. I'll be like, here, so I'm doing this. I'm like, oh, but I also need to talk about this. And then okay, but we'll come back here and then go down here again. And it would drive a neurotypical person mad to try and follow that train of thought.
I've given my wife my first drafts, and she's been like, "What the fuck?" It's like,
Yeah.
where did this come from? I'm like, "I'll
Yeah,
give you my third draft from now on."
yeah. And I'll be like, be writing back, okay, I'm gonna put brackets here, like, talk about this thing because I don't want to talk about it now. I'm thinking about this other thing, but I don't want to forget that I need to talk about this thing.
Mhm.
And that's always fun when I run into those while I'm recording an episode and being like, oh no, I didn't find that part. And now I have to like stop recording and actually write a couple sentences here.
Yep.
And then be like, and then I like will be doing like, oh, I did. A paragraph later, I said that. Shoot, now I have, which one do I want to use now?
The joy of editing.
Yeah, right. I'm like, people are like, you sound so professional. I'm like, you did in one take. I'm like, nope, that did. No, no. If you heard me record, you would be like, you do this professionally? What's wrong with you? Uh,
Not to like tangent, but I am super curious about that. I've actually heard about a number of podcasters who like have on their Patreons, like the people are allowed to come in and listen to their first recordings before it's edited. And like people get really surprised, like, wait, this is like 4 hours of recording to put out like 1 hour of recording. And the like, yeah, it is not often that you get that much great content from like a little bit of time. Like there's usually kind of a big split up like that. So you ever thought about doing that, letting people into the creative process?
I don't think they'd like to hear all my coughing and burping that I do while I'm trying to get air out of my body. Um, I have an editor, so I'm like, be like, okay, I have to cut this out because I don't want to send this all to Stefan. He's not going to want to hear all this crap because it's gross.
Oh my god. I
And
say
then
this
me
with
like,
a sore ass throat too.
yeah, be like when I'm like get to a word that's just a little bit longer than normal and being like, okay, I need to say this word 6 times to lexicographic, lexic, lexicographical. There we go. Said it right. Now let's say it in a sentence. And then there was that. Oh God, I can't say it. Well, talk. I could say it individually, but not with other words around it. That was last week. So you mean so? Yeah, I've not really thought about doing that part of because I'm like, maybe for interviews it would be fun and fine and okay, and like I could have people like be like, hey, submit a question. But for the monologues, it would be bad. Especially, I think I'd be more in my head about how I'm doing it, and um, yeah, lots of swearing.
Lots of swearing. I love that. So when you've been doing all of this, kind of like moving us back into the actual conversation of the interview that we're doing right now, what's been like the most rewarding part of this?
I would like to say that it's helping people, but it's really my own benefit of just spending the time to think through these things for myself and like actually helping my own ADHD processes out. Most of the episodes are like I do listener questions and I do interviews, but a lot of the episodes are me being like, I am having an issue. Let's solve it. And that has been really helpful for me to be able to spend the time to not only figure out a solution, but then like really dive into what that solution entails and why I want to do it that way and how it is I think one of the best things is it then forces me to view so many of the things I am trying to deal with through the lens of having ADHD rather than the issue by itself.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I
Like,
definitely also identify with that a lot. Like a big chunk of why I do the work I do with the nonprofit and why I do coaching and all of that stuff is primarily It helps me stay on track of keeping up with my own stuff because I'm constantly reminding myself of the techniques and tricks and tips and all that stuff that I'm helping other people actually put in their lives. Like, oh, hey, maybe I should remember to do that myself.
Mm-hmm.
And keeping that kind of stuff in line with my worldview. It's working it into my actual memory core instead of just being these things that I just ignore or forget about constantly. And I think that's been one of the biggest struggles I've seen with so many people with ADHD is they don't remember to implement the things that they needed in their lives more because they don't talk about it more. And like this is where that repetitive talking, listening to podcasts, reading the books, being a part of the community, that really does help us because we are constantly talking about the solutions to our problems. And yeah, definitely understand that one.
And I also think it really is helpful that when I'm doing it, it is forcing me to into this role of non-judgmental commentator.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, which is now something that I've internalized a lot more when I'm dealing with self-talk but initially self-talk was a really hard issue with that I had, that it was just constantly like negative talking to myself about why I can't solve this issue. And then even getting into things like I'd be trying to solve something even through the lens of ADHD and being like, just do these things and trying to get away from this idea of being human garbage kind of stuff. And then because then when I write about I can't write that about someone else. I don't even feel that way about someone else, so I wouldn't. But when I'm writing about it, I'm like, well, this is the issue I'm dealing with, and I'm not saying they should be. Okay, darn it. Reset. And then it's that slowly morphed into my own self-talk where I'm like, yeah, how do you solve this? And what are the steps you need to take? And being like, yeah, it doesn't even matter if I am garbage. It How do I solve this? Like that negative self-talk doesn't help and it doesn't matter if it's true or not. So just don't do it much anymore.
I mean, you're taking your subjectivity out of the equation and putting the objective like solutions into place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 100%. All of you out there should become podcasters so that you can learn this lesson and get rid of the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, no, it's like the imposter syndrome still exists, but we talked earlier. What's it like when people recognize you? I'm like, why? Are you listening to me? What's going on here? But the other negative self-talk, that's gone. But yeah,
Yeah.
and then I did have that like I was writing something the other day and it was like, best advice for how to work on your ADHD. Start your own podcast. Write a book? I don't know.
I mean, is that in the future for you? Like, is a book in the possibilities? What's coming for hacking your ADHD?
What's coming? Well, I one of the things when we were working together last year, was it last year or the year before that?
Last year.
Okay. I I have ADHD. I have no sense of time. And one of the things was talking about working with an assistant, and that is uh, you set me up with some things I didn't follow through with, and
ADHD, kind of a thing.
yeah, I'll do the first step, and then oh, they want something else. I'll get to that, and then a month later, oh no, do I have to start this process again? I don't know. I'm just not going to do anything now. But talking with Brendan Mahan, he helped me setting me up with someone that he was working with. That guy ended up getting a job, and so then I had to find someone else. And was talking to one of my high school friends, and now I'm working with him because I need to get out of my current job and I need something else. And because of that, I am going to be like that's part of like my monetization pushes. I'm like, no, I'm not working with someone. I have to make sure that I can pay them
Mm-hmm.
what they're worth because that is a value of mine apparently. And it's something where I'm like, okay, let's do some more things. And so trying to work pushing towards doing a more of a community thing. I'm gonna because now that I'm working with someone else, it's a lot easier to be like, I'm gonna focus on this. If you can do these things, this is great. And doing some more community stuff that's not social media, figuring that out, probably something like a Discord. And then also going to be closing my Patreon and opening up a different kind of place. I think it's Ko-Fi, the KO-FI. It's coffee. Or is it coffee? Probably coffee. Gonna have some other content on there. changed to a pay what you want model. I didn't really ever like the tiers of Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
And because I'm like, yeah, just if you have some money and want to give it to me, great. If you have no money and don't want to give me anything, fine too. Like talking with my friend about this, like, hey, let's make sure that they don't think that more money equals more access. It's all $0 and whatever you want to pay is the same. I don't want to. I mean, it's like video games. I hate the pay to play model. It's awful.
Mm-hmm. I definitely understand that as I play
Um,
Call of Duty constantly.
so yeah, so that's kind of the way. And yeah, I think a book would also be a fun thing to work on because I've always wanted to be an author since always. Like I can like I didn't read until my fourth grade, and at that point I started reading way too much.
Right.
And then I was like, this is what I want to do. And so I get some of that through writing for the podcast because I am like writing every week, nearly every day. And so book would be good.
There
Just
you
need
go.
to figure out what I need to figure out what the idea worth writing about is. So I also one of the things I don't want to ever be doing is just doing things to make things that don't need to exist.
Right. Right. Definitely understand that. All right, man. Well, 200 episodes. This is a huge celebration. I want to say, personally speaking, as a fan and as somebody who's worked with you, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of the work that you've put into what you do and what you do for the community. And, congratulations, brother. Just want to
Thank
sit
you.
here and say that. And I really appreciate you deciding to come on our show and talk about it. And for all those out there, if you've not heard of William Kerr, you should be checking out Hacking Your ADHD. It's on all the platforms out there. And apparently, when I talk him into it, a book.
Yeah. And episodes are much shorter than this. So if you're
Yep.
looking for something short, that's where you should go.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on, man. Really appreciate it.